Good morning, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. Welcome, welcome. Letting a couple more people in, and we'll begin right away. So, welcome.
Hello.
So, this is the Edgewalker Cafe on February 2nd, 2023. I'm Judy Neal, the founder of Edgewalkers International, and it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Edgewalker Facilitator and Renaissance woman, Sandra Bargman, who's going to facilitate our session today with Joseph Lee. Sandra,
thank you. Thank you so much, Judy Neal. And hello, Edgewalker community. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is a complete honor to be with you today. And again, thank you, Judy. But I do want to shout out to Susan Furness and Patricia Campanile, who could not be with us today, for all of your support and upliftment and warm welcome into this community. So I'm tuning in from the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, just a little bit north of New York City. And if you're a hippie at heart, it's just outside of Woodstock, New York. And so please, I encourage everyone to say hello in the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. And some of you may recall that I was, as a budding new member to the Edgewalker community, asked by Judy to be a presenter last August for the August Edgewalker Cafe that was entitled Living on the Edge of Every Day. And it was a great pleasure and a great honor to share my work and my vision around the edge of every day. And since I've become an Edgewalker facilitator, so I can be a more active member in the community. So I, again, am thrilled to be here. Thank you, Judy Neal. And most importantly, I am thrilled and honored to share the wisdom, warmth, and work of our guest today, Joseph Lee. Because I'd like Joseph to take part in our opening contemplation, I'm going to introduce him before we sink into that. So hello and welcome, Joseph. Welcome to the Edgewalker Cafe community gathering.
Thank you so much. I've heard so many good things about the work that you are all doing, and I am honored to share the morning with you.
Well, and we are honored to have you. I couldn't be more thrilled that you've agreed to come and be with us. I'm going to read your bio now. Joseph R. Lee is a Jungian analyst in private practice in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He is the co-creator of the very popular podcast, This Jungian Life, and the online learning platform Dream School. He is co-author of The Key to Dreams, to be published by Sounds True Books in spring 2024. He has lectured widely on the Hermetic Kabbalah and the Western Mystery School tradition, focusing on reinterpreting arcane concepts into modern and accessible idioms. You can learn more about Joseph's work at depthpsychotherapy.net and thisjungianlife.com. Again, welcome, 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 Joseph.
Thank you.
Of course. So we are going to dive into our contemplation before we hear this spectacular presentation. Judy has kindly asked me to share some of my music in the contemplation. So I thought I would begin with an inner alchemy grounding visualization that leads into one of my favorite songs of all time. Joseph, I know you're going to know this one, which is particularly apropos for today's presentation by Joseph Lee. So let's start by taking a moment to get comfortable wherever you're sitting and to close your eyes, sitting relaxed but upright, and start to take some slow, deep breaths in through your nose and gently out through your mouth. And again, in, out through your mouth. And bring your attention to your body and try to relax any muscles that are feeling tense, dropping your shoulders, continuing to breathe deeply, feeling yourself relaxing more and more and finding stillness within your body. And now bring your attention to the top of your head. Continue to breathe slowly as you focus your awareness on the crown of your head. After a few more breaths, bring your attention upward to the universe above. Imagine stars shining down on you, casting warm and radiant energy upon your body, remembering that you are intimately connected with all of existence. Taking another few deep breaths, keeping your eyes closed. Still breathing, deeply breathing. And listening to the song as it begins and welcoming you to open your eyes whenever it feels appropriate. On a clear day, rise and look around you, and you'll see who you are. On a clear day, how it will astound you that the glow of your being outshines every star. You'll feel part of every mountain, sea, and shore. You can hear from far and near a world you've never heard before. And on a clear day, on that clear day, you can see forever and evermore. Could anyone among us have an inkling or
How spectacular.
Oh, my goodness. There's a song from our past, Joseph Lee. Here, a quick note. I know Joseph Lee from college. We both went to Carnegie Mellon University and met when we were baby 18-year-olds. So thank you. That was great to share. That, by the way, if anyone's interested, that is from the show On a Clear Day You Can See Forever by Burton and Lang, which is a musical about psychic gifts, reincarnation, and analysis. So that's a great seg into Joseph. I'm going to just read your paragraph for those who might not have read it to go into your spectacular presentation. The alchemy of change, ancient wisdom for modern challenges. For over 2,000 years, visionary thinkers have been intrigued by the possibilities of transformation, the promise of turning common elements like lead into precious gold fueled by their imaginations. Can we ask whoever has not to please put themselves on mute? Thank you. In 1928, the eminent Swiss psychiatrist Jung turned his attention to Chinese alchemy and found an intuitive brilliance in its descriptions and images that clarified his understanding of human potential. These ancient allegories depicted a sequence of changes that could be applied to personal and even organizational problems, offering a way to liberate deep authenticity from the contaminants of historical paradigms. Take it away, Mr. Joseph Lee.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to first offer is that Jung himself was unquestionably an edgewalker. That he started out in a very conventional home. He was the son of a Swiss pastor. He went to university, became a young psychiatrist, worked in a psychiatric hospital called the Bergholzli. This was in that churning birth of psychology and an understanding of how the brain works. We know so much more now, but he was being a good boy in the beginning. Following the path and respectable. As Freud became very influential, his ideas reaching all across the world, Jung came across them and felt full of promise and excitement about it. Freud was the first psychotherapist who was really talking about the healing process of the dialogue. It's hard to think that 100 years ago, the doctor didn't necessarily think of talking with somebody about their suffering. It actually just wasn't part of their understanding. When Jung started his work, they were experimenting with hypnosis. And the discoverer of hypnosis was a guy named Mesmer, which is where we get the word mesmerize. And the French psychiatrists were very interested in this process of putting people into altered states and seeing how dramatically their personalities would change. This introduced them to the idea that there was a known part of the personality and a mysterious part of the personality, that there actually was an unconscious mind. Prior to that, most people simply assumed that whatever was coming forward in the personality, whatever the person said, how they behaved, was really the whole story. So putting people into a trance and having them see things, speak about things that they seemed not to remember when they were awake was actually a revolution. Freud was interested in this. The French psychiatrists were. Jung was exposed to it. But Freud went deeper. He began to investigate people's stories, their narratives. And what he observed as a neurologist is that as people unfolded their story with a little bit of encouragement and safety, they would happen upon a memory that they had forgotten, which would cause an enormous release inside of them. That Freud used the old Greek dramaturgical term catharsis. And that when this tension was released, people's odd symptoms seemed to resolve as well. Symptoms that Freud couldn't explain as a physician. He continued to develop his work throughout his life. Jung was very excited by this possibility that a dialogue could actually help some of his patients. And of course, as he got to know Freud and they began a dialogue, it actually began to help him as well. He and Freud had a remarkable conflict. Right when things were very intense, it was a trauma for Jung, and he fell into an overwhelming depression. And the depression was so severe that he began to experience visions, things that we might associate with a kind of shamanic state, being between the worlds. He would encounter these inner characters who seemed to know things that he could not know. This is a very strange story. He began to write this down in a series of notebooks that he eventually turned into an illuminated manuscript that's called the Red Book, which was released only within the last decade. The Jung family was so concerned that him being identified as an edgewalker, somebody who was doing and feeling extraordinary things, would ruin his reputation as a valid psychological thinker. And so they hid it away. And Jung was afraid of that as well. Finally, they put out a beautiful rendition and they discovered that the time was right. And there was a place for someone who had extraordinary experiences that could not be accounted for with a kind of simplistic psychology. There was an inner figure that taught him this strange code that looked like runes that actually have never been identified or cuneiform. And he would flash these codes to Jung at various times in these visions. And his biographers had to go through and piece together all these encounters to decipher this strange code that this inner figure was providing in these messages. This was extraordinary. I think perhaps in other cultures, in other parts of the world, it would not have seemed quite so odd, but in proper Swiss culture, in the early 1900s, there was just no paradigm for this kind of thing. It also was agonizing to him. The suffering that he experienced psychologically brought him to complete despair. And he writes in his biography that he was considering suicide. And he kind of called out into this inner world that if this does not stop, I am going to shoot myself. And he kept a pistol in his bedstand. And then he had a dream, finally. And in this dream, he walked into an old medieval town square. And in the middle of the square, there was a circular pool of water In the middle of that was a circular island. In the middle of that was a luminous, fragile tree. And what he encountered was an image of a mandala. And something about that image gave him the certainty that there was a power greater than himself that was going to put his fragmented self back together, and that he could go on, and it did. This extraordinary initiation into both suffering and these remarkable states of consciousness informed Jung's entire psychology, although he was very careful to word it in the psychological language of his time. He wrote in his biography that he suffered greatly thinking no one could ever understand what he was doing, and perhaps he didn't realize that he might have masked what he was doing so well that people couldn't actually really see him. But now we can speak much more plainly about this extraordinary person and his contribution. He walked on the edges of Swiss culture. He walked on the edges of the psychiatric community. He walked on the edges of his family. He was radical, turbulent at times. People were very critical. He caused a lot of pain because he was sorting himself out. And yet, by the time his life was over, he had such a profound impact on the global understanding of the human soul and how it functions to a certain degree. Despite his brilliance, and he was brilliant, he also understood that what he saw was only a glimpse. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, people criticize me for not being complete in my theory, but they don't understand that I'm just walking around the central fire, and I'm just telling you what I'm glimpsing. So Jung's work, and in his own mind, was a beginning. And he also famously said, "Thank God I'm Jung, so I don't have to be a Jungian." So, he could feel the way people were kind of grabbing his stuff and codifying it and wanted to teach it as a method. And he kept telling them, I don't want this to be a method. I want this to be the beginning of a journey and people to run with it and do what they need to do with it. And of course, it became a method, and I trained in the method. And I'm a certified Jungian analyst, which I think would have appalled Jung in a certain way. But, we live in the culture we live in. As Sandy said in the introduction, Jung was very, very interested in the images of antiquity. Because he worked in a psychiatric hospital and then, of course, in private practice, patients would report extraordinary visions, strange, uncanny things. Once Jung had his own visionary experiences, he really understood how profound this was. He was trained in the classics, of course. He had a full education at that time. He was exposed to Greek, Latin, all of the things we would imagine that a fellow in the 1920s would learn. So he continued this investigation of ancient cultures and ancient imagery. Now remember, this was a time where Western Europe was penetrating the Near and Far East. So all of a sudden, sacred texts, Sanskrit, ancient Hebrew, Egyptian papyri were being cataloged, recorded, and analyzed, and became available to Western thinkers. And as he was exposed to these unusual ancient images, he began to recognize that many of those images and themes were showing up in his patients' dreams. And average people that there is a universal process that all human beings seem to go through, particularly when the very deep layer of the psyche is activated, which often happens when we are in desperate need. If our life is pretty smooth and we're fairly integrated, we might not have a dream that turns our life upside down. But for many of us, for many reasons, we have been alienated from our authentic self. Maybe it's a culture that is remarkably oppressive. Maybe it was a childhood where our natural self was dismissed, that we had to pretend we were something else. But when the culture or the individual strays too far from the authentic, something deep, deep, deep inside of us stages a revolt, a kind of revolution. And this intensity begins to bubble up inside of us, and this demand to accommodate this corrective archetypal imagery. In the average person, this might look like, having a dream where there's a bear that's 3 stories high walking around in Central Park. I mean, that's a mythic bear. And someone has the dream and they see it and they fall to their knees. We're in an ancient strata of the psyche where bears populated the mythic imagination. And Jung would then go and research this myths and images and try to get a sense of how to expand this strange and uncanny image. At a certain point, he came across the writings and images of the alchemists. Now, the alchemists were the historical predecessors of our modern chemists. I mean, in one way, they were natural scientists. And their writing was strange because there was no language to describe what they were seeing. So they were left with their religious vocabulary, their mythic vocabulary. Sometimes they would make words up, put a little bit of this, a little bit of that, shake it up, heat it, leave it alone for a year, take it back, heat it up again. It would change color. But they were doing what organic chemists are doing now, discovering compounds. But they would describe it as, we take the soul of magnesia and then blend it with the sulfurous power of the sun. We heat it and introduce the unpredictable spirit of Mercurius, and 40 days later, it does thus and such. But they were actually trying to be rather precise. Like that was the vocabulary they had. As that system of images and symbols expanded, other more mystical intuitives began to borrow that process and create a philosophical alchemy. And we hear that in the change of the language at a certain point. Jung was very interested in both. But what the promise of the alchemists is that something that had very little value, lead, which was a very common element, could, by some extraordinary process, become gold, which is highly valuable. But the philosophic alchemists took that as a spiritual metaphor, that the darkest parts of our personality have embedded in them a potential to be remarkably valuable, but they must go through an intense transformative process. And by extension, I would say that culture and the systems within the culture and perhaps specific organizations also must be subject to a kind of alchemical process. I work with a couple of business organization consultants who use some of these ideas as they are communicating to organizations and staging changes in the culture of an organization. They don't use strange alchemical words, which I would find personally fascinating, but I think the average MBA might be left a little cold by that. But they're taking these ancient ideas and finding modern idioms and Gestalt processes and finding that it produces results. That it's rather remarkable because it's activating that deep, deep layer of the human psyche that recognizes the invitation to move through these stages of change. So I'm going to talk about just three or four of these ideas. And I'm going to relate them first to the individual. Jung was an introvert, and introverts naturally tend to flow, or their curiosity flows to their inner images. The curiosity of extroverts often flows outward into the objects and people around them. And you can always tell this. Extroverts never throw anything away because everything in their house has a story. And they actually feel like, well, if I got rid of that bowl that Sally gave me on July 4th when we were talking about her mother, I would actually never remember that story. So the images around them have all of this investment. Introverts can take or leave the objects because they're really in active relationship with what's inside of them. Jung understood this, but he also understood something that was very radical. And this was part of his schism with conventional psychoanalysis, that there is a strata of our own human psyche that connects us to all of life. Now, again, we're exposed to this idea through shamanic practices and some yogic philosophies, but that was an extraordinary declaration to himself and to others. And in his states of consciousness, he had some experience of that, not just a theory of it. That if we go down deep enough inside of ourselves, we come to what he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is difficult to describe because it is so much more than any single ego could contain, but it holds images of who and what we were meant to be, and many other archetypal patterns which shape our understanding and experience. There seems to be this interplay between human experience and the preset archetypes in the unconscious, that energy and these matrices flow back and forth. So when we are trapped in an internal organization or an external organization, we first have to identify the thing that we are curious about changing. And this goes to something called the identification of the prima materia. What is the actual problem? Now, at first blush, and this is a great challenge for all of us, we will be tricked into thinking that the problem must be exactly what the problem tells you it is. To really listen to that there's a collective voice that says, what we need is, or there's somebody in your family that says, you're the problem. You have a teenager. You never let me do what I want. Now, if any of you that are parents would be suspicious of that declaration. Is that really the problem? Should I expect my teenager to be in a state of full self-knowledge so that when they describe exactly what they need, it really is what they really need? We still have to hear what they're saying and be empathic to it, but we bring a curious, conscious quality to what is the complaint. Now, we take this for granted when we go to see a physician. Somebody says, my belly aches. Well, the physician doesn't say, well, you got a belly ache, next. But the physician is paid and is an expert, that he's going to go beyond the symptom and try to discern what's happening that gives rise to the system. And by addressing what's happening, there is any hope that the outer symptom could be remedied. So the first thing we need to at least consider is that we are defended against psychological pain. And when we feel this call to transform or the need to shift, and we look inside ourselves, we will, for most of us, notice two kinds of suffering if we really pay attention. One is called neurotic suffering, and one is called authentic suffering. Neurotic suffering is actually a survival method that the human soul, or particularly the modern human soul, has developed, which is this feeling that I can't really face what's terribly and achingly wrong in my soul. And I'm going to refocus on something else that I can kind of handle. So an example of this may be somebody who has a problem, a substantial problem with overeating and maybe life-threatening health issues because of their overeating. And at first blush, they say, well, my real problem is my overeating. And they try all the diets and they fail. And any number of different things occur that don't ever seem to get to the problem. But what's underneath that is feeling profoundly lonely. And what's underneath that are traumatic experiences of being alienated as a child. It feels less painful to spend a couple of decades trying diets than it does to actually go down into the shadow and really reclaim those tender, delicate parts of the soul that felt alienated, that actually need attention and integration. So describing or discovering the prima materia is an active process, and that's the same with groups as well. That the group says, we need more paid vacation. They might really enjoy more paid vacation, why we all might, but is that actually what that suffering voice is about? It, and people who do change management spend a lot of time discerning the source of suffering so the actual problem can be named. I'm going to rather quickly move through a few other ideas, but we can see that identifying the actual part of us or a system we're embedded in that is broken or aching is a delicate process. What gets in the way is replacement suffering. When we realize this, the next step is to create containment. That the alchemists had to forge these very specific laboratory devices. They called them a vase or a vessel. And that was its own art because they'd boil things, they'd create enormous pressure. It's like Pyrex glass. It's got to stand up to that. And then they would put the substances in it, and they would make it hermetically sealed. Now, that's a strange word if we think about it. We hear the word hermetically sealed, meaning it's absolutely sealed. But the reason we have that word comes from the alchemists, because they believed if they put mercury, quicksilver, or the spirit of mercury into something, that it could and would change. So we can't let mercury escape. It's got to all be kept in the vessel. So what this means is that the first part of change is to frustrate our natural impulse to want to vent, to want to act, to want to howl, to want to confront. We keep it inside and we begin to wonder, what am I projecting onto people and situations, and what's really mine? And we begin this process of realizing that we have a shadow. We have disowned parts of ourselves that we find very unappealing, or have been told are unappealing, and we project them onto other people and circumstances. By at least holding that philosophy, we pull them back and we suffer, not accusing other people of our own brokenness. That creates a kind of heat, which the alchemists called the calcinatio. When we can suffer ourselves with enough containment, a rather extraordinary process begins to happen, that a part of our authentic self begins to separate from the oppressive traumas that we have experienced. And how to imagine it is that, let's just say that you were just a very friendly child, and there was a trauma to that. You were very friendly, maybe to a dog, and the dog bit you and really hurt you, and that's very traumatic. And then you have this deep distress and distrust. But what happens is our unconscious mind will tell us, I'm never going to let myself feel that friendly again. I'm never going to run up to something that I don't know what it is. And also the intolerable pain of that gets pushed in the unconscious, and then we go on with our lives and we forget that we used to run towards something that was ready to greet us and wrap our arms around it, because that became something that wasn't going to be repeated. As we contain, we begin to sense these excruciating feelings rising up, which are the traumatic feelings that we could not tolerate. And if we can bear them, the traumatic feeling will burn off, and we will remember the original psychic wound. Remember that moment. And more importantly, under that, you will remember the little kid you used to be. That, what? I used to be that person that just threw my arms open? I didn't even think I was going to get hurt. Like, I used to be that guy. I used to be that guy. And that's the process of separating the authentic from the oppressive, which can only happen in the vessel of containment. So the 3 steps as I finish is to become suspicious that the problem is often not what the problem says it is. Once I discover it, I have to put it in a very tight vessel so that I am not going to act out. I'm not going to blame people. I'm going to meditate on it, and then to have faith that something will come back to me that at first will seem deeply awful, but underneath it is a piece of gold, a piece of who you used to be that you've forgotten. So I'm going to pause now and turn the session over to Sandy.
My goodness, thank you so much, Joseph. There's so much deliciousness to think about. What jumps out at me that was when you began talking about the religifying of his work, and that was so prominent at that time, that this him resisting wanting it to be turned into something bigger. And so it's fascinating how it lines up with history at that time.
Yeah.
But yes, I want to open this up and not comment any further, open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Let me go back real quickly. I don't see any questions. I'm scrolling
There's
back.
comments like
Comments, I
Ralph.
see, yes.
Yeah, Ralph has a comment and Matt, yeah, I think there's some things people want to share, but they may have questions in those
As well.
sharing. Wonderful
And I see
energy
that
and
Elizabeth Lorraine is in the house. Does she have a question? No pressure. A burgeoning Jungian
and
analyst
Corinne
herself.
has her hand up.
Oh, I don't see Corinne. Oh, got it. Hi. Oh, hello, Corinne.
Hello.
Co. How are
Yes,
you?
Co is right. I'm fine. How are you doing, Sandra?
Excellent.
Great. This is a great topic for me. I actually spent 3 years being coached by a dream therapist who was a Jungian dream therapist. And one thing that bothered me in my life or this life was that I always had to be achieving. And there was a great fear in me if I did not do it. We got back, and we had many dreams, because 3 years is a lot of dreams, but we went back to a trauma. This is a terrible trauma. That in World War II, I was in a concentration camp, and I was in a situation where we were playing bingo. And the idea is if you lost, someone would die. So that it was a trauma that I believe in me was I have to win. I have to do well. I have to be right. And so I can never stop for a long time in this life of always looking forward, not taking even a second to say, oh, I did that right, but to go to the next because someone might die. So I had that experience. And I just wanted to know from that, or from any experience, how do you coach to being, to actually overcoming, in this particular case, fear? Just that thought.
So, how we might work, there's many ways to work with a traumatizing image, but if we'll stay within this alchemical lens, what we would do, one, is to decide that only you and I are going to talk about this. That's putting it in the vessel, like all the tension of it, all the intensity. We're going to keep it in this singular vessel of the conversation. So that's going to begin to do some things there. The next thing we'll do is we'll take the specific images of the dream or the image or the memory and continue walking around them and seeing about the feelings, body sensations, intuitions, and thoughts that keep rising out of it, which is very laborious. It can be extremely painful because our survival mechanism wants just to bury that in the psychic ground, like it's too hot, it's too excruciating. And of course, as a child, there are many experiences that a child's psyche cannot tolerate. And there's a wisdom in burying it because the child's got to survive. There is failure to thrive syndrome, that children are under too much stress. The system doesn't work. So it's a saving grace to cut things off and put them away. And we can even be thankful that some spirit in the psyche knows that. But we're stronger now. Our bodies are stronger, our egos are stronger. So we continue to walk around it, and at first, there is going to be all of the distress and fear and trauma, continuing to hold it. But where Jungians are different is that there's a determination that there is something precious under that the distress that's remembered is true, but under it is a memory of who you were before that happened.
Mm.
And that memory can return something to you that was forgotten because it got encapsulated in this terrible experience. I can't predict what that would be. It's so personal. It's so unique to each individual. But I've had that experience, and I can't even describe how remarkable it is. How remarkable it is to feel like I didn't even know I used to be like that. I didn't know that part of my natural self. It's been gone for 50 years. Comes back, and there's tears and capacities and feeling. So underneath the fear is some way that you were before the atmosphere of fear took everything over. Maybe it was a capacity to trust, which right now may seem academic, but to really remember who you were when you just trusted people, life, the earth, to actually remember you used to be that girl, that causes a revolution. The dance between the collective and the personal is so profound because when we look out into the world and other relationships, and we sense any of the dynamics that seem familiar to the trauma that caused us to cut off, then we will tend to flatten out the complexity of what we're looking at, and then either attack it or flee from it or freeze or get really posturing and tough. All of these defenses kick in, and we're unable to see or even analyze the complexity of what we're projecting something onto. It's like in a vapor. We don't know that. We're sure that we are absolutely correct in what we're doing. When that piece returns to us, it is extraordinary to look back out in the world at various situations, not everything, and be able to say, oh my gosh, that was only ever happening in me. It is shocking to have that feeling. The other thing that we're all struggling with, particularly right now in the world because of the incredible connectivity we have, is that we are so vulnerable to the diminishment of consciousness and the something called participation mystique, which is an idea that came from an anthropologist that was one of Jung's, actually a little older than Jung. And it was the theory, which I think is true, that when people are part of a group and the consciousness of the individuals drops down enough, they will participate in a collective state of consciousness and join together in a collective myth. So we see this happening like in QAnon, that people will, some millions and millions of people will believe something like Pizzagate, right? There's a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and underground there's a child slavery cell, and that certain politicians purchase them, and even so far as maybe even devour them. Like, I mean, these ideas are extraordinary. Like when we're awake, we're like, oh my God, like I've been to that pizzeria. Like this is ridiculous. But if you imagine that people are listening and listening, they're in a slightly trancy state, as we often are when we're watching our computers and televisions, and then we're put into a state of fear and fatigue. And when fear and fatigue keep coming at us, our ego gets weak and we drop down into a liminal space And then these strange cultural myths suddenly seem very real to us, that our objectivity is lost. And then we begin acting as if a million people have all experienced something which actually has never happened. Jung said that that is the problem of the eon. That's where human beings are, that we've survived as various kinds of ancient small groups and then larger and larger nations, but we still had some sense of individuality until mass advertising was born, which, by the way, was created by Freud's nephew, which is really interesting and strange, is the creator of mass marketing by manipulating people's unconscious minds. There's a great documentary called The Century of the Self that the BBC put out, which talks about this fellow's harnessing of the information. Humanity is at an absolute crisis around the fantasy that we are actually having a collective experience that we ourselves have never actually experienced and acting as if it's a fact. And it is causing large groups of people to behave in dangerous ways. Sometimes those collective fantasies are fun or even silly. But when people show up at the Capitol with guns, and people are getting killed because there's a collective fantasy about something or other, and they're really sure it's true, it's dangerous. And Jung watched the movement, the awakening of the collective fantasy in Germany, and the way people who had lived next to someone for 20 or 30 years, their neighbors, they were like baking pies for each other, helping each other's kids. And suddenly in the collective fantasy, they're calling out the SS and reporting them for being Jewish. And Jung's knowing this, and he's trying to figure out as a psychologist, like, what is that? What is it about human beings that they could possibly be possessed by something, a collective fantasy? So the collective fantasies involve a number of different vulnerabilities. And when we're in a collective fantasy, we lose our individuality, we lose connection to reality, and we are vulnerable to participate in mythic atrocities because we're not actually fully awake, which does not excuse anyone. So this lowering of ego self-awareness and participating in collective experience is highly dangerous. And Jung felt that that probably couldn't be addressed on a collective level. He probably would have come out against, let's say, letting your kids spend 5 hours on social media. But he also would have said, I don't think we're going to change social media. What he did say, and I have some belief in it, that every individual that separates out from these collective fantasies has a field of influence around them that actually seems to wake other people up. And Jung said that, people said that about Jung, that sitting near him seemed like a darshan experience, seemed to wake them up and give them the sense of being free from these terrible illusions, some of which are very small, based on family stories, but some are massive cultural illusions. So much to be said, but I know that our time is drawing to a
Yes,
close.
it is. And we have one more question. I hope everyone can stay on from Siobhan, can stay on. And Elizabeth, I know you had a question I will connect you to. Before we give our final announcements, Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank you, Joseph. Sexy voice, by the way. Thank you very much.
We
Very
said this, I said as
pleasurable
much.
hour listening to you. I want to hear you've been, you kind of finished there on the darkness and the shadow of that kind of collective group. But I want to really touch on the positive side of the group and the power of the group, because no matter how mythical that collective is, it will be groups of people that will help to change it. It won't be individuals. And so I'm really interested in group alchemy and how you can harness that and how you can to turn that kind of, I really loved your definition at the beginning, turning those kind of common compounds into something precious. And that's certainly the experience that I have with groups that I work with, is I get to experience that group alchemy of seeing those individual souls, mixing them together, and from that something precious emerging both externally and within. And so my question's a really naughty, cheeky question. I'm actually teaching facilitators this year about group alchemy and how do you create it and how do you harness it. What would be your kind of 3 critical elements that you think they would need to understand to know that?
Joseph, if I may, please, keeping this under 5, because we're after our time. Thank you.
Of course. I'm going to give myself a little timer because I tend to be long-winded.
It's glorious. We love it. However, we're over time.
So let me put you to a few resources, and I'm going to reach into the spiritualist and magical community for this. There's a really interesting book called The Magical Battle of Britain, which was written by Dion Fortune, who was an extraordinary occultist, actually, living in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in England. And she talks about her group working powerfully to activate an archetypal energy to protect the psyche to protect the British psyche from being overwhelmed by the juggernaut of the German will. Because what was happening is, it wasn't that everybody was even fighting against the Germans, is that they would come to the borders with so much vitality, with so much power, that communities did not have the will to resist. They could not access another kind of archetypal frame to unify them and stand against it. We saw that in Afghanistan, that as the Americans withdrew, even though the native Afghanistan soldiers had weapons, the stories are that they simply backed away and let insurgents simply take control of the systems. So there was something in the spirit of the culture that had not unified them, as you're saying, Siobhan, had not galvanized them to a larger mission and left them in a state of collapse. That's a theory, of course. So Dion Fortune felt that the antidote to the German archetype of Wotan, which Jung believed had activated in the collective German psyche, which is a pre-Christian god of war and wind, and that much of the rhetoric seemed aligned with that ancient mythology, much of the symbolism and the way it lit up and possessed the culture. So she and her group worked diligently in their processes to activate the mythology of Arthur, the Arthurian legends. And she felt that that would be the vaccination that the English people had to psychically remember that part of their own roots, to cling to their identity, their sense of virtue, and the activation of the ancient king who can protect and resist incursion, psychological incursion. It remains to be seen whether or not that influenced the culture of the war. But it's in this realm of how might one work with a group to create a kind of antidote for the larger. The other topic that I would encourage you to consider is there's an old European occult word called egregore, E-G-R-E-G-O-R-E. And it comes out of this early 19th century where theosophy and anthroposophic work and other spiritual groups were trying to define the field of energy that groups create and co-participate in. And through various meditative and even ritual practices, how can that group energy be purposed? And here, be purposed to the evolution of consciousness often, but could be purposed in any number of ways, including nefarious ways, by the way. So that's a little bit. Jung might also say that if one were to choose an alchemical sequence and even imaginally enter into the images and interact with them, the whole group decides this month we're going to enter into the beginning of the sequence. We're going to go into the card. We're going to imagine it. We're going to report to each other the feelings, the thoughts, the body states. What do we think about it? We'll research it. That's a way of evoking or at least inviting, because we can't control each other totally, but of inviting a group process. And if it's a wholesome process, like this purification and emergence of what is most true in us, one could probably buy into the effort of the group to do that. So there's probably many books that could be written on this question, but that's a few resources.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Nice, juicy stuff. And you've given me lots of ideas as well. Thank you.
Great. All right.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you, Joseph. I'm going to turn it over to you, Judy Neal, for any closing announcements and house cleaning and upcoming events, et cetera, and then we will ask Joseph to lead us out with a closing poem.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think I'll do a little meditation instead. I couldn't find the poem. I hoped I could.
Oh, got it.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you so much, Joseph. You can see from the chat, which we will save, that there's a huge amount of energy and reaction. And of course, below the surface of those words are other people full of energy and reaction and questions. And, it's easy to imagine spending a whole day with you, Joseph, and only then touching the surface. There's so much depth and possibilities and exciting energy in what you're sharing with us. Sandra, you have a gem in Joseph, truly. Thank you for bringing him to us.
I thank you, Joseph, so much for joining us. Thank you for that.
My pleasure. And
So-
might I just say that there is one book by a guy named Edinger called Anatomy of the Psyche, which is about alchemy and makes it accessible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely.
So my announcement is that next month, 4 weeks from today, on March 2nd, my guest will be Joel Bennett, who was here with us for a while but needed to go to another meeting. And he has given me some things to share with everyone, which I will do through the Edgewalker newsletter. So some things to read about or think about before his session. Joel is an expert on organizational development and wellness and spirituality and time and intimacy. He's got a lot of really, really interesting areas of focus that he can share with us. And so we welcome you all back. These Edgewalker Cafes are for free. They're recorded. Please share them with others. I think, Joseph, what we're trying to do is create that field of influence, that energetic field where people somewhere in the vicinity get healed, become more whole. And we do our little bit to help raise the consciousness of the world. So we come together collectively. I know Siobhan is doing that with her learning communities, and each person here is doing that in their own way. And so we come together in community to encourage and support one another. It does take courage to stick your head up above the mass advertising consumption economy and say, we see something more here that makes life rich and can be flourishing for all of us. So again, thank you. I want to turn it back over to you and Sandra for our closing. Thank you so much.
Oh, Judy, so beautifully said. Thank you for that. And again, Joseph, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing yourself with this new community of mine. And I am indebted to you, and I look forward to more conversations offline. So let us all take a nice deep breath together in appreciation for all this wisdom and warmth and insight we've received from you, Joseph, as you close us out with your beautiful closing meditation.
Oh, and
Before
one
we
thing
do-
before that,
Yes.
Joseph, how can people get in touch with you, learn more, follow up? Well,
The easiest way would be to just look at the write-up, and my website is there. But listening to our podcast, This Jungian Life, Jungian Life, easiest way. My private practice is bigger than I can manage right now, so it would be difficult for me to work individually with more people right now. But in This Jungian Life, we attempt to bring people into these concepts, offer resources, and direct people to analysts who they might be interested in their various cities and states. But I'd like to perform a small bit of alchemical magic right now. So I'll just sink into it. Sandra, are you there?
I'm here.
Sandra, I am going to alchemically transform your video problem of your camera.
Oh, no.
So what I want you to do is, on the bottom left, I want you to see the video icon and click the upward pointing button. And then click video settings. And then click advanced. And then unclick optimize video quality. That Zoom has a systemic problem ruining people's video feed by their optimization thing that takes the noise out. So just a bit of alchemical magic before we meditate. Okay. We'll close our eyes for a second. And just as Sandy had suggested, we'll just breathe. And I would encourage you to put your hand on your belly beneath your belly button. That those of you that are yoga practitioners would know this, but there is an astounding effect when you can, you did it, Sandy. Sandra, right on. You solved the alchemical problem. Turn that prima materia into gold. Put your hand below your belly button. Close your eyes. And I want you to breathe in such a way that when you fill your belly, that area below the belly button swells, it opens, and then it recedes as you exhale. And it can take some concentration. And one of the complexes you'll be up against is you're going to think your belly's too big. But try to remember when you were a baby and you would have never thought that way. that you have a memory of when you never gave your belly a single thought, cinching it in, tightening it up, all that stuff. You put your hand there and inhale all the way down near your hip sockets. And if we can give ourselves permission to do that, this really marvelous release just happens naturally. Now I want you to imagine we're going to just walk down a flight of stairs. And to actually feel yourself standing at the top of a flight of stairs on the landing. And I want you to actually feel your legs moving as you step down 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps, 7 steps, and you're almost at the landing, 8 steps, and you walk down a hallway. There's many doors, but at the far end of the hallway is an ancient door. And on the door is the astrologic symbol of Mercury, that circle with the little horns on top and the cross on the bottom. And you open that door and find yourself in a field. And close by is a hill. And you simply walk towards the hill. And as you approach the foot of the hill, a small rabbit rushes past you and darts into a hole at the base of the mountain. And you think to yourself, well, how marvelous. And you turn and see that there are stairs leading upward into an opening in the mountain. There are 7 steps. Each one's a different color. And at the top, there's an interesting, beautifully carved entrance. And you decide, if you decide, that you're going to walk up the stairs. And as you step on the first step, you become aware of this dark, foreboding energy inside yourself, the shadowy parts of yourself. And then you step up another step, and the shadowy feeling becomes a population of inner figures. And you realize that you're not alone inside there, but your ego is just one figure on the landscape. And then you step up the third step, and you begin to realize that some of those figures have nothing to do with you. Some of them are just spouting stuff you learned in grade school, and some of them are spouting some stuff that a religious teacher told you, and some of them are talking like a politician. And you think, that's not me. I mean, they're there, but that's not me. And you step up another step, and you begin to feel this clean water rushing over your feet and over the landscape, and some of those strange figures that don't belong there are really gently just carried off. You step up the 5th stage, and you begin to sense that this fresh feeling that you have is something that you want to share with people. You want that you're in relationship to other people that are in the darkness. You step up another step, and you find yourself curious about the wisdom teachings that could help you. Maybe it's Carl Jung, maybe it's the Vedas, maybe it's Kabbalah, maybe it's Thomas Merton. But you begin to think, I need to find more wisdom. And then as you step onto the last step, you begin to imagine that the wisdom of the ages begins to fill you. And as it fills you, it turns your body a rosy red. And in alchemy, they associated wisdom with redness because the way you make red glass in the ancient world was by adding a little gold to it. And strangely enough, it would interact with the silica and produce red glass, which made it rare and precious, full of the gold of wisdom. And then you find yourself walking into a cavern, a carved, spacious cavern. And as you proceed, step by step, there's an altar. And upon the altar is a small cabinet, which is called an adytum. It's an old word, and it was the word that described the secret room in the ancient temples where people thought the god of the temple resided. You walk closer and closer and begin to feel something big, objective, potent. You stand there, you realize there's a way that you could just fit your fingers in and open the door, and it's totally up to you now. If you're guided, open the door and notice what happens to you. And if you don't think you're ready, that's okay too. And you could proceed down to the bottom of the hill. Either way is perfectly fine. If you open the door, I want you to feel determined that you're going to remember the images and sensations. How am I feeling right now? What am I thinking? What are the visions? What's going on in my body? I'm going to carry this back to consciousness. And after you register the effect, if you open the door, gently close it, because another initiate will someday return there. You turn around and very thoughtfully walk from the temple and down the stairs and really pondering what you encountered. And when you come to the meadow again, you notice the rabbit darting out of the mountain. You just notice it out of the corner of your eye. And you walk across the little meadow. You see the door with the symbol of Mercury. And you're determined to carry your impressions back to waking consciousness. You're really determined. So you open the door and close the door firmly behind you because we want the worlds to stay separate. So we need to be grounded. And we walk down the hallway. There's those steps leading up, and there's 10 steps leading up, and by the time you get to the top step, you'll be wide awake, but you will remember. 1 step up, 2, 3, 4. You can really feel your body in the chair right in the room you're sitting in. 5, 6, more awake. 7, more awake. 8. Take a moment. remember one thing that you're going to do after we're done here, which is up back in your life. What's a task that you've got to accomplish today? Okay, back in the stream, one step up 9, and at the top it's 10, 10, 10, and just open your eyes. Some people's experiences are subtle, but subtle experiences are appropriate and can be very helpful if we think about them. Some people may have chosen it's not the right time, and that always must be respected, because you know whether it's the right time to open certain doors in yourself or not. It's up to you. And so I hope this has been an interesting little canopy of ideas. And I support all of you, moving forward and in all the ways that feel important to you.
Thank you, Joseph Lee. And thank you to everyone again for spending this time with us. And I know that Judy will be sharing the recording of this exquisite conversation probably later today. Yes?
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. Okay. And once again, this jungianlife.com, depthpsychotherapy.net. And we'll see you on March 2nd for the next Edgewalker Cafe.
And I'm going to ask you and Sandra and Joseph, just stay on another minute as we say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.